All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking something incredibly fascinating. We're looking at how two of history's absolute heavyweights, ancient Rome and imperial China, built their social pyramids. Like, how did they actually decide who held the power? We're going to dig into the data and the historical records to map out the real architecture of inequality. This is the stuff that literally defined millions of lives over thousands of years. So think about your life right now. Your job, your bank account, your social circle. Got it? Okay, now let's play the lottery of birth. If you were suddenly dropped right into the middle of these super rigid ancient hierarchies of Rome or China, where exactly would you land? More importantly, what would your life actually be worth in the eyes of the law? Here's our roadmap for today. First up, the elites in power. Then, the working masses. Number 3, slaves and outcasts. Fourth, the rules of mobility. And finally, the modern transformation. Section 1, the elites in power, hoarding authority. Right off the bat, there's a massive philosophical difference in how each of these empires justified who got to hold the reins. Over in Rome, you had the patricians. This was an upper class defined pretty much entirely by bloodline. They controlled the best land, they packed the Roman Senate, and their status strictly hereditary. You were either born a patrician or you just weren't. But Imperial China, well, they eventually shifted away from that kind of hereditary aristocracy. By the Song and Qing dynasties, the ruling elite were the gentry, the mandarins, and their power wasn't just about who their dad was. It was justified by hitting the books. Literally, they had to achieve rigorous academic mastery of Confucian philosophy through a completely grueling civil service exam system. Now, back in Rome, this strict social hierarchy wasn't just a government thing. It was mirrored perfectly right inside the home. Roman society was a patriarchy in the absolute purest sense of the word, entirely governed by the concept of the pater familias, that's the eldest male head of the household, and he held absolute legal jurisdiction, which they called patria potestas, over literally everyone living under his roof. It's crazy to think about the puppet strings here. A Roman woman or child possessed only the social status of their pater familias. Your destiny was, quite literally, owned by him. He controlled the education, he maintained strict authority over his sons even after they grew up and got married, and he arranged all the marriages. In fact, one early form of Roman marriage, called coemptio, was basically a legal, business-like purchase of the bride. It's wild. The hierarchy was totally inescapable, all the way from the Senate floor down to your dinner table. Section 2, the working masses, the backbone of the empires. So, what about the people actually doing the heavy lifting? Well, the really crucial point here is how each culture viewed the whole concept of work. Roman society heavily valued the property-owning soldier. You had the plebeians, they were the laborers and the fighters, and they were often tied to those wealthy patricians we just talked about through a super strict patronage system called clientela. But in stark contrast, Chinese Confucianism morally elevated the agricultural peasant. Farmers were genuinely revered as honest providers. They were seen as the very foundation of the nation's survival. And here's a fascinating twist. While Rome lets wealthy business class amass a ton of social power, Chinese Confucians looked at merchants as kind of secondary, unproductive leeches, honestly, who thrived on shady business practices instead of honest, hard labor. Now, if you want proof that the Roman system was completely rigged, just look at the math. In the Centuriate Assembly, the guys who literally declared wars and elected magistrates, your voting power was tied directly to your bank account and whether you could afford to buy your own military armor. Pay attention to the top tier here. The wealthy equestrians and the Class 1 citizens held 98 votes between them. But the combined lower classes, even though they outnumbered the rich by a massive, massive margin, only held 95 votes. So the system was literally hardwired so the wealthy elites could outvote the masses every single time without fail. Talk about stacking the deck. Section 3, slaves and outcasts, the lowest rungs. Of course, both of these massive empires relied heavily on an underclass, but they went about it in really different ways. Roman slavery was this colossal institution. It was legally defined by sheer misfortune, like falling into debt or getting captured in a war. It actually wasn't based on race at all. Slaves were viewed as property, doing absolutely everything from farming to suffering in the brutal conditions of the mines. Meanwhile, over in Imperial China, especially during the Qing dynasty, they categorized a legal lower class that they quite literally called the mean people. This included slaves, sure, but also entertainers, prostitutes, and even low-level government employees. They were legally segregated, heavily discriminated against, and completely banned from marrying the quote-unquote good commoners, or even sitting for those civil service exams. Section 4, Rules of Mobility, Escaping the Caste. So you're probably wondering, how did you actually escape this? For the Romans, cold hard cash was your primary lever for upward mobility. If you could scrape together enough money to buy your own armor, you could serve in the military and literally buy your way up the census ranks. Your other option was that clientele system we touched on, basically attaching yourself as a loyal client to a powerful patrician patron. They could boost your social status, but only in exchange for your absolute, unwavering loyalty. Interestingly, even freed slaves, the liberti, could join the plebeians and sometimes build these huge fortunes in business. But let's be real, actually getting true political power in the Senate, yeah, that remained practically impossible for them. Now, in China, your path out of the peasantry was intellectual. It was all driven by that notoriously grueling imperial exam system. An entire family would pool every resource they had just to invest in one son's education. They'd cross their fingers and hope he could master this incredibly complex Confucian philosophy and pass these insanely difficult, almost arbitrary written tests, like the infamous eight-legged essay. So technically speaking, this meant any poor peasant could rise up to the elite ruling class. But realistically, come on, it heavily favored the wealthy families who could afford years of expensive, private tutoring. Still, for the extremely rare few who actually passed, boom, the entire family's social status was transformed overnight. Section 5. The Modern Transformation, Rebuilding the Pyramid. Fast forward to the 20th century, and wow, things change at a dizzying pace, like blink and you miss it. In 1905, those ancient exams, abolished. By 1911, the entire imperial system fell completely apart. Then we jump to 1949, and the communist victory kicks off the Mao era, which completely flips the social script on its head. And then, in 1978, Deng Xiaoping triggers these massive economic reforms that effectively shatter whatever was left of the old system. Let's zoom in on those last two eras, because they are wild. So the Mao era radically reorganizes society basically overnight. The old elites, the landlords, the wealthy business class, they are systematically eliminated through the super aggressive land reform. But here's the catch. A completely new hierarchy pops right up to replace it. Society becomes strictly divided by the hukou. This was a rigid household registration system that trapped you in either an urban or a rural designation. It created this massive inequality because urban dwellers suddenly had priority access to food and welfare. On top of that, your social worth wasn't about the property you owned anymore. It was entirely based on your political background. So a new elite class of revolutionary cadres essentially stepped in and replaced the old mandarins. But then we get to 1978. Economic reforms sweep in. They dismantle the commune system, and they literally smash what was called the Iron Rice Bowl, which was basically the system of guaranteed state employment. The long-held stigma against intellectuals and merchants completely lifted. Suddenly, your status shifted away from that strict political identity and pivoted right back toward employment, education, and wealth accumulation. This was a real game changer. It paved the way for the massive wave of social mobility that ultimately built China's modern middle class. And just look at where that leaves us today. By 2016, the data shows a completely stark contrast to the ancient agrarian empires we started this explainer with. I mean, for thousands of years, the peasantry made up like 90% of the population. But here, agricultural workers have plummeted down to roughly 40% of the workforce. They've been overtaken by this massive, surging class of service and industrial workers. The social structure isn't defined by rigid bloodlines or some arbitrary essay exams anymore. It's driven by a highly dynamic, hyper-industrialized economy. So as we wrap up this explainer, we've seen exactly how the lottery of birth dictated absolutely everything, from your basic legal rights all the way to your literal survival in ancient Rome and China. And it leaves us with this final, kind of provocative thought to chew on. If those ancient empires used the price of military armor or memorized Confucian texts to rigidly decide a human's worth, what are the invisible barriers shaping your social class today? Are we really completely free from the architecture of inequality? Or, has the system just been redesigned? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. And hey, keep questioning the structures around you.